the Belgian Malinois refused to move. For 3 full minutes, the dog stood rigid at the edge of the scorched field, every muscle taut beneath her sand-colored coat, her dark muzzle pointed toward a section of earth that should have meant nothing. Her handler, Michael Torres, had seen this behavior before in war zones overseas, but never here, never on what remained of his own land. He called her name twice. She ignored him completely, something she had never done in 6 years of flawless service. Instead, she began to dig with a frantic intensity that sent charred soil flying behind her powerful haunches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What she unearthed from beneath the ashes was not debris from the fire. It was a waterproof metal container, deliberately buried, sealed tight against time and dirt. Inside that container were documents that would prove the fire had been no accident. Inside were secrets that a billion-dollar corporation had spent decades trying to erase. And inside were the names of people who had died to keep those secrets hidden. The life Michael Torres had rebuilt from ruin was about to collapse again, but this time, he would not run from the flames. The Idaho dawn broke cold and colorless over what had once been the Torres family farm. Michael stood on the concrete foundation of his destroyed barn, the only structure that remained after the blaze had torn through his property 3 weeks earlier. Everything else was gone. The farmhouse where he had planned to spend the rest of his life. The equipment shed with tools his grandfather had used. The chicken coop he had built with his own hands during those first optimistic months after moving here. All of it reduced to blackened timber and twisted metal, a landscape of ash that stretched across 12 acres like a scar on the earth. He was 42 years old, though the lines etched deep around his eyes and the silver threading through his close-cropped black hair made him look older. Michael Torres was a man built from discipline and hard experience. He stood just over 6 feet tall with the lean, corded build of someone who had spent years carrying heavy loads across hostile terrain. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of both a soldier and a farmer. His face was angular, with high cheekbones inherited from his mother's side and a strong jaw that he kept clean-shaven out of habit. His eyes were a startling pale green, an unusual contrast against his brown skin, and they carried a watchfulness that never quite shut off, even in sleep. He wore practical clothes, always practical. Faded work jeans, a thermal shirt beneath a canvas jacket, and steel-toed boots caked with the ash that covered everything now. Around his neck hung a small silver cross on a thin chain, the only piece of jewelry he owned, a gift from his younger sister before his first deployment. He touched it sometimes without thinking, a reflexive gesture when his mind drifted to places he would rather not revisit. Michael Torres had served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, much of it with a specialized reconnaissance unit that operated in places the public never heard about. He had been good at his job, perhaps too good. The skills that made him valuable in combat, the ability to move silently through enemy territory, to observe without being seen, to make split-second decisions that kept his team alive, those same skills had made it difficult to return to a world where the threats were not always visible, where the rules of engagement were unclear. He had left the service with an honorable discharge, a chest full of commendations he kept in a drawer and never looked at, and a diagnosis he tried not to think about. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the doctors called it. A collection of symptoms that manifested as nightmares, hypervigilance, an inability to relax even in safe spaces, and occasional flashbacks triggered by sounds or smells that transported him instantly back to moments he desperately wanted to forget. The farm had been his escape, his attempt to build something instead of destroy, to cultivate life instead of ending it. He had purchased the property 2 years ago with money he had saved during his deployment, a run-down piece of land in rural Idaho that nobody else wanted. It had been hard work, back-breaking and endless, but it had also been healing. The rhythm of planting and harvesting, the simple satisfaction of fixing what was broken, the vast silence of the open land, all of it had given him something he had not felt in years. Peace. Or at least the promise of it. Then 3 weeks ago, everything had burned. The official report from the fire marshal called it accidental. An electrical fault in the barn, they said. Old wiring that had overheated and sparked. "These things happen in old buildings," they told him with sympathetic shrugs. The investigator had spent maybe an hour walking through the ruins before making his determination. Michael knew it was a lie. He had rewired that barn himself just 6 months earlier, following code to the letter. He had been meticulous because he understood systems, understood how things failed when you cut corners. There had been no electrical fault. But when he tried to push back, tried to demand a more thorough investigation, he hit a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The case was closed. The insurance company, citing the official report, was dragging its feet on the payout. And the representative from Cascade Development Corporation, the company that had been pressuring him to sell his land for the past year, had called him 2 days after the fire with a revised offer, delivered in a tone that was carefully neutral but unmistakably smug. Michael had refused that offer just as he had refused all the others. This land was his, bought with his own money, cultivated with his own hands. He was not selling, not to Cascade, not to anyone. But refusing had consequences. The fire was just the latest in a series of incidents. His irrigation lines had been cut twice. Equipment had been vandalized. A load of feed had been contaminated, forcing him to throw away $3,000 worth of supplies. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as bad luck or petty vandalism, but together they formed a pattern. Someone wanted him gone, and they were willing to play a long, grinding game of attrition to make it happen. He stood now in the ruins, surveying the destruction in the flat morning light, trying to decide what to do next. The temporary trailer he was living in sat at the far edge of the property, a cramped metal box with a space heater and a cot. It was a far cry from the home he had lost. He had started clearing the debris, sorting through the wreckage for anything salvageable, but progress was slow. Every piece of charred wood he lifted felt like lifting the weight of his own failure. A sharp bark pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Roxy bounding toward him across the blackened field, her movements full of energy despite the early hour. Roxy was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, with a lean, muscular frame and a coat the color of sand and rust. Her ears stood alert and upright, constantly swiveling to catch every sound. Her dark eyes were intelligent and focused, missing nothing. She had been Michael's partner during his last 2 years in the service, trained for explosive detection and patrol. When he left the Marines, he had been given the option to adopt her, and he had done so without hesitation. She was not just a dog. She was a fellow veteran, a working animal who understood discipline and purpose, and she had adapted to farm life with the same focused intensity she had brought to every mission overseas. She reached him now and sat immediately at his feet, her posture perfect, her gaze expectant. He crouched down and ran his hand over her head, feeling the coarse texture of her fur. "Morning, girl," he said quietly. She leaned into his touch, her tail sweeping across the ash-covered ground. Roxy had been out on her morning patrol of the property, a routine they maintained every day. Even though there was little left to patrol now, Michael kept up the habit because routines mattered. They provided structure, a framework that kept the chaos at bay. He stood and whistled once, a short sharp note, and Roxy fell into step beside him as he began walking the perimeter. The land itself was still beautiful despite the destruction. The property sat in a shallow valley surrounded by low hills thick with pine trees. A creek ran along the western boundary, cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. In the distance, the peaks of the Sawtooth Range rose against the pale sky, their summits still white with early winter snow. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was the kind of place that should have offered solitude and safety, but Michael no longer felt safe here. The fire had stolen that from him. As they walked, Roxy moved with her characteristic precision, her nose working constantly, processing the thousands of scents that humans could never detect. She paused occasionally to investigate something, a footprint in the soft earth near the creek, a section of fence that had been disturbed. Michael watched her carefully, trusting her instincts more than his own. She had saved his life twice overseas, alerting to hidden explosives before anyone else sensed danger. Her skills had not diminished with retirement. They were near the northeast corner of the property, close to where the old barn had stood, when Roxy's behavior changed. She stopped abruptly, her body going rigid. Her ears pinned forward and her tail dropped low, a posture Michael recognized immediately as her alert stance. She stared at a specific patch of ground near the foundation, a section that had been part of the barn floor, now exposed and blackened. "What is it, girl?" Michael asked, moving closer. Roxy did not respond to his voice. Instead, she took 3 precise steps forward and began to sniff intensely at the ground, her nose moving in tight circles over an area no larger than a dinner plate. Then, without any command, she began to dig. This was not normal behavior. Roxy was trained to alert, not to dig. She was disciplined, responsive to commands, and she never acted on impulse. But now she was tearing at the earth with single-minded determination, her powerful front legs sending dirt and ash flying behind her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Michael called her name sharply, using the command tone that always brought instant obedience. She ignored him completely. He stepped forward, intending to pull her back, but something made him pause. Roxy was not playing or chasing prey. This was purposeful. This was the same focused intensity she showed when she detected explosives, when she knew something was there that needed to be found. He watched her for a moment longer, then made a decision. He walked back to the trailer and retrieved a shovel. When he returned, Roxy had already excavated a shallow hole about a foot deep. She was panting now, her tongue lolling out, but she showed no signs of stopping. Michael knelt beside her and gently pulled her back, taking over the digging himself. The ground here was softer than he expected, as if it had been disturbed before and then packed down again. He worked the shovel carefully, turning over the ash-darkened soil, watching for whatever Roxy had detected. After 10 minutes of steady digging, the shovel struck something solid with a dull metallic clang. Michael stopped, set the shovel aside, and used his hands to clear away the remaining dirt. What emerged was a rectangular container, roughly the size of a large toolbox, made of heavy-gauge aluminum with reinforced corners. It was military surplus, the kind of waterproof case used to transport sensitive equipment in harsh conditions. The surface was scratched and dented, covered in dirt, but the seals looked intact. Michael sat back on his heels, staring at the container. He had never seen it before. It had been buried beneath the barn floor, hidden deliberately, and the only reason it was accessible now was because the fire had destroyed the structure above it. He looked at Roxy, who sat watching him with her ears up, her breathing still rapid. "Good girl," he said quietly. "Good work." He lifted the container out of the hole. It was heavy, perhaps 40 pounds, and he could feel objects shifting inside when he moved it. There was a latch mechanism on the front, secured with a heavy padlock that was rusted but still functional. He carried the container back to the trailer, Roxy following close at his side. Inside the cramped space, Michael set the container on the small fold-down table. He retrieved a bolt cutter from his limited tool collection and applied pressure to the padlock shank. The rusted metal resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack. He removed the broken lock, flipped the latches, and lifted the lid. The interior of the container was lined with foam padding, and within that padding were layers of items wrapped in plastic sheeting. Michael carefully removed the first layer. Inside the plastic was a thick stack of documents, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. He spread them out on the table, his eyes scanning the pages with growing disbelief. They were internal memos from Cascade Development Corporation, dated from 15 to 20 years earlier. The letterhead was unmistakable, the corporate logo still clear despite the age of the paper. But it was the content that made Michael's hands start to shake. The documents detailed a chemical disposal operation, a deliberate dumping of industrial waste into groundwater sources across 3 counties. The memos discussed cost savings, regulatory avoidance, and acceptable risk levels. They included maps showing disposal sites, coordinates marked with precision. And they included projections, cold calculations of how long it would take for contamination to be detected and what the legal exposure might be if it ever came to light. Michael set those documents aside and unwrapped the next layer. More papers, these ones bearing the seal of the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. They were test results, water quality reports showing dangerous levels of toxic compounds in wells and streams. The dates on these reports corresponded to the time period covered by the corporate memos. But these were not public reports. They were marked as internal preliminary findings, stamped with red lettering that read, "Do not distribute pending executive review." They had never been released to the public. They had been buried, just like this container. The third layer contained something different. A stack of photographs, old film prints that had been carefully sealed in a separate plastic envelope. Michael opened the envelope and slid the photos out onto the table. They showed industrial equipment, large tanker trucks parked at remote locations, men in coveralls operating pumps and hoses. In several of the images, liquid was being discharged directly into the ground, into pits that had been hastily excavated and would presumably be filled in afterward. In one photo, a sign was visible in the background, marking the location as state forest land. In another, the face of one of the men was clearly visible, and Michael recognized him. It was Gerald Vance, the current CEO of Cascade Development Corporation, though in this photo he was much younger, perhaps in his 30s. He was standing beside one of the trucks, consulting a clipboard, overseeing the operation. Michael sat down heavily on the edge of the cot, his mind racing. What he was looking at was evidence of a massive environmental crime, one that had been deliberately concealed for 2 decades. Cascade had dumped toxic waste across the region, poisoned the water supply, and then used its influence to suppress the government reports that would have exposed them. The scale of it was staggering. The potential damage was incalculable. And the fact that this evidence had been buried on his property meant that someone had known. Someone had tried to hide it here, in a place they thought would remain undisturbed. He thought about the fire, about the series of escalating incidents, about Cascade's relentless pressure to buy his land. It all made sense now. They were not just trying to expand their holdings. They were trying to recover this evidence before anyone else found it. Whoever had buried this container had likely died or disappeared, leaving it hidden for years. But Cascade knew, or suspected, that it was here. And when Michael refused to sell, they decided to force him out. The fire had been an attempt to destroy not just his livelihood but any possibility of this evidence surfacing. What they had not counted on was the strength of the container, the depth at which it had been buried, and the remarkable nose of a trained military dog. Michael looked down at Roxy, who had settled on the floor at his feet. "You found something big, girl," he said softly. "You found something they were willing to kill for." Because that was what the last layer of the container contained. At the very bottom, wrapped separately, were handwritten notes on legal pad paper. The handwriting was hurried, cramped, the writing of someone under stress. Michael read through them slowly, piecing together a story that made his blood run cold. The notes were written by someone named David Garrett, an environmental engineer who had worked for the state in the late 90s. Garrett had been assigned to investigate reports of groundwater contamination in the region. His investigation had uncovered the illegal dumping operation run by Cascade. He had documented everything, gathered evidence, prepared a comprehensive report that would have resulted in criminal charges and massive fines. But before he could submit that report, he had been warned to stop. The warning had come from his own superiors, who had made it clear that pursuing the case would end his career and possibly worse. Garrett, realizing he was being silenced, had made copies of everything, hidden them in this container, and buried it on land owned by a friend, someone he trusted. He had planned to wait until the political climate changed, until he had allies who could protect him, and then he would bring the evidence forward. The notes ended abruptly. The last entry was dated October 17, 1999. It said simply, "They know I have copies. I'm leaving tonight. If something happens to me, this is the proof. Make them pay." Michael felt a chill run through him. He pulled out his phone and searched for David Garrett's name. It took only a moment to find the results. David Garrett had died in a single-vehicle car accident on October 18, 1999, just outside of Boise. The official report called it a tragic loss of control on a rain-slick mountain road. No other vehicles were involved. The case was closed. Michael set his phone down and stared at the documents spread across the table. He was holding evidence of environmental destruction, government corruption, and very likely murder. And the people responsible were still in power, still running Cascade Development Corporation, still wielding enormous influence. They had burned down his farm to keep this hidden. They would do worse if they knew he had found it. He thought about his options. He could take this to the police, but the local sheriff's department was small and underfunded, and Cascade had deep ties in the community. He could contact the state police or the FBI, but that would take time, and he had no guarantee they would act quickly or protect him in the meantime. He could go to the media, but journalists needed time to verify and investigate, and in that time, Cascade would know what he had. They would come for him, and they would come hard. Roxy stirred at his feet, looking up at him with her dark eyes. She sensed his agitation, the tension radiating off him in waves. He reached down and scratched behind her ears, taking comfort in her steady presence. "We're in trouble, girl," he said quietly. "We just became the most dangerous people in Idaho." He stood and began carefully repacking the documents into the container, taking photos of each page with his phone as he did so, uploading them to a secure cloud storage account. Redundancy was key. If something happened to the physical evidence, the digital copies would survive. When he finished, he sealed the container again and hid it beneath the floorboards of the trailer, covering it with a rug. It was not a perfect hiding place, but it would have to do for now. He stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sun was higher now, burning through the thin clouds, casting long shadows across the scorched land. He could see the tire tracks where the fire trucks had torn up his driveway 3 weeks ago. He could see the skeletal remains of his chicken coop, the twisted metal of his destroyed tractor. Everything he had built was gone. But he also saw something else now. He saw the truth behind the destruction. He saw the desperation of powerful men trying to bury their crimes. And he saw an opportunity, however dangerous, to do what David Garrett had not been able to do. To make them pay. Michael Torres had spent years learning how to survive in hostile territory. He knew how to move unseen, how to gather intelligence, how to strike when the enemy least expected it. He had tried to leave that life behind, to become someone softer, someone who built instead of destroyed. But the war had come to him anyway, brought to his doorstep by men in suits who thought they could intimidate a farmer into silence. They had made a critical mistake. They had forgotten, or never knew, that the farmer was also a Marine. And Marines do not surrender their ground easily. He looked down at Roxy, who sat at attention beside him, waiting for orders. "We've got work to do," he told her. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The dog's tail wagged once, a quick decisive movement, and Michael felt something shift inside him. The fear and uncertainty of the past weeks began to crystallize into something harder, something focused. He had a mission now. He had a purpose. And he had the evidence that could bring down an empire built on lies and poison. All he had to do was survive long enough to get it into the right hands. He turned and walked back toward the trailer, his mind already planning the next steps. He would need allies, people he could trust, people with the skills and resources to help him navigate the dangerous path ahead. He would need to be smart, to move carefully, because Cascade would be watching for any sign that he had found something. And he would need to be ready for them to come at him again, harder this time, with the full weight of their corporate power and their willingness to use violence. But for the first time since the fire, Michael Torres felt something other than grief and rage. He felt clarity. The mission parameters were simple. Protect the evidence. Expose the truth. Survive. Everything else was just noise. He had operated under worse conditions with fewer resources. He had faced enemies who wanted him dead and had fought his way out. This would be no different. This was just another deployment, another battle in a war that never really ended. And this time, the stakes were not just his own life. They were justice for David Garrett, accountability for decades of corporate crime, and the safety of everyone who lived in the contaminated shadow of Cascade's operations. He stood in the doorway of the trailer, looking out across the ruins of his farm, and made a silent promise to the man who had buried the evidence all those years ago. David Garrett had died trying to protect this information, trying to hold evil men accountable. Michael would finish what Garrett had started. He would make sure the engineer's sacrifice meant something. He would make them pay. Roxy pressed against his leg, her warmth and weight a reminder that he was not alone in this. He reached down and rested his hand on her head, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Let's get to work," he said quietly. And together, the veteran and his dog turned back to face the long fight ahead. The public library in the town of Riverside was a modest single-story building constructed from red brick in the 1960s, its architecture practical rather than elegant. Michael Torres pushed through the heavy glass doors just after 10 in the morning, Roxy walking calmly at his side. The dog wore her working vest, a simple black harness that identified her as a service animal, which allowed her access to public spaces. It was not entirely a deception. Roxy did provide a service, though not the kind most people assumed. She kept Michael grounded when his mind threatened to spiral into the dark places where memories waited like landmines. The interior smelled of old paper and floor wax, a combination that Michael found oddly comforting. A handful of patrons sat scattered among the tables, elderly men reading newspapers, a young mother with 2 small children in the picture book section. Behind the circulation desk sat a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore simple clothes, a gray sweater over jeans, and reading glasses that she pushed up her nose as she looked up from her computer screen. Her name tag identified her as Sarah Brennan, head librarian. Michael approached the desk with the calm, unhurried movements of someone who did not want to draw attention. Sarah looked up and offered a professional smile that faltered slightly when she noticed Roxy. Her eyes moved from the dog to Michael's face, taking in the weathered features, the watchful eyes, the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice friendly but cautious. Small towns bred caution around strangers, especially strangers who looked like they had seen hard miles. "I hope so," Michael replied, keeping his voice low and even. "I need access to your historical archives, specifically newspaper records from the late 90s. I'm researching local environmental history." Sarah's expression shifted from caution to interest. She was a librarian, after all, and researchers were always welcome regardless of how they looked. "We have microfiche records going back to the founding of the paper in 1923, she said. "The viewing equipment is in the back room. Let me show you." She led him through a narrow corridor lined with reference books to a small windowless room that contained 2 bulky microfiche readers and several filing cabinets. The machines were relics from another era, beige plastic housings yellowed with age, but they still functioned. Sarah pulled open one of the cabinets and ran her fingers across the labeled drawers. "What year are you looking for specifically?" she asked. 1999, Michael said. "October through December." She pulled out a drawer and extracted several small boxes containing the film reels. "These are chronological by month. The reader is straightforward. Thread the film through here, use this knob to advance. If you need copies, there's a print function, 25 cents per page." She paused, studying him with curiosity. "Are you working on something academic? We don't get many researchers in here." Michael had prepared an answer for this question. "I'm writing a book about rural land use patterns. Trying to understand how development companies operated in the region during that period." It was close enough to the truth to sound plausible, vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. Sarah nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, good luck with your research. I'll be at the front desk if you need anything." After she left, Michael closed the door and sat down at one of the machines. Roxy settled on the floor beside his chair, her head resting on her paws but her eyes open and alert. Michael loaded the first reel of film and began scrolling through the pages of the Riverside Chronicle, the local weekly newspaper that had been documenting small-town life for nearly a century. He moved methodically through September and into October, scanning headlines and articles. Most of it was mundane: school board meetings, high school sports scores, obituaries for elderly residents. But on October 20th, he found what he was looking for. A small article buried on page 6 with the headline "State Engineer Dies in Highway Accident." The article was brief, almost perfunctory. David Garrett, age 34, an environmental engineer with the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, had died when his vehicle left Highway 12 near milepost 47 during heavy rain. The car had plunged down an embankment and struck a tree. Garrett had been pronounced dead at the scene. The article noted that he was survived by a wife and young daughter, and that he had been a respected professional who would be missed by his colleagues. There was no mention of his work, no hint of what he had been investigating. It was the kind of article written about people who die in ways that are considered unremarkable, tragic only to those who knew them. Michael photographed the article with his phone, then continued searching. He found a follow-up piece 2 weeks later, a small announcement that a memorial service had been held. No further investigation was mentioned. The case had been closed as quickly and quietly as a door shutting on an empty room. He switched to a different search strategy, looking for any articles about environmental concerns or water quality issues during that period. It took another hour of careful scanning, but he found several. In August of 1999, there had been a community meeting about reports of foul-smelling water in private wells in the northern part of the county. Residents had complained of odors and discoloration. A state official, unnamed in the article, had promised to investigate. In September, a brief follow-up reported that preliminary tests had found no significant contamination and that the odors were likely caused by naturally occurring minerals. The matter was considered resolved. Michael sat back from the machine, his jaw tight. The timeline matched perfectly with Garrett's notes. The engineer had been investigating those complaints when he uncovered the illegal dumping. He had been preparing his report when he was warned off. And then, conveniently, preliminary tests found nothing wrong, and the investigation quietly died. Weeks later, so did Garrett. He printed copies of all the relevant articles, feeding quarters into the machine and collecting the grainy reproductions. As he worked, his mind turned over the implications. Cascade Development Corporation had not just buried toxic waste. They had corrupted the very agencies meant to protect the public. They had people inside the state government, people willing to falsify reports and suppress investigations. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than he had initially understood. He packed the printed articles into his jacket and returned the film reels to their boxes. When he emerged from the back room, Sarah was helping an elderly man find a book on local history. Michael waited until she was free, then approached the desk again. "Find what you needed?" she asked. "Some of it," Michael replied. "I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something else. I'm trying to track down information about Cascade Development Corporation, specifically their operations in this area during the late 90s. Would you know where I could find that kind of information?" Sarah's expression changed subtly, a tightening around her eyes. "Cascade," she repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "They're a big employer around here. Own a lot of land, run several operations. Why are you interested in them specifically?" Michael noted the shift in her demeanor, the sudden wariness. "Just trying to understand the major players in regional development," he said. "They seem to have been very active during that period." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, meant only for him. "Can I ask what you're really researching?" Michael met her eyes, trying to gauge whether he could trust her. There was intelligence there, and something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe suspicion. He made a calculated decision. "I'm looking into some environmental issues that may have been covered up." David Garrett's name came up in my research. Recognition flashed across her face. "David Garrett," she said quietly. "That was a long time ago." Did you know him? She shook her head. No, but I know about him. My predecessor, the previous head librarian, she knew him. They were friends. She used to talk about him sometimes, about how his death never sat right with her. She thought there was more to the story than what was reported. Is she still around? Michael asked. Your predecessor? Margaret Chen. She retired 5 years ago but still lives in town. I could give you her number if you want to talk to her. Sarah paused, studying him with a new intensity. But I should warn you. If you're digging into Cascade's business, you're going to make enemies. They don't like people asking questions. And they have a lot of influence in this county. I've noticed, Michael said dryly, thinking of his burned farm. Sarah pulled out a slip of paper and wrote down a phone number, sliding it across the desk. Margaret's number. Tell her I sent you. And be careful. People who cross Cascade tend to have bad luck. Michael took the paper and nodded his thanks. As he turned to leave, Sarah spoke again. What happened to your farm? The one that burned down a few weeks ago. That was you, wasn't it? Michael Torres? He stopped, turning back to face her. How did you know? Small town, she said simply. Word gets around. The fire marshal said it was an accident, but there were rumors. People said Cascade had been trying to buy your land, that you refused to sell. Her eyes moved to Roxy, then back to Michael. I'm guessing the fire wasn't an accident. Michael said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. I thought so, Sarah said quietly. Look, I don't know what you found or what you're planning to do, but if you're going up against Cascade, you're going to need more than newspaper articles. You're going to need allies. Margaret might be able to help you. She's been around a long time. She knows things. Thank you, Michael said. For the information. And the warning. Just don't do anything stupid, Sarah replied. And don't get yourself killed. I'd hate to have to catalog your obituary. Outside, the morning had turned gray and cold, heavy clouds rolling in from the mountains. Michael walked to his truck, an old Ford with rust eating through the wheel wells and a cracked windshield. Roxy jumped into the passenger seat, and Michael climbed in behind the wheel. He sat for a moment, the engine idling rough, looking at the phone number Sarah had given him. Margaret Chen. Another thread to pull, another person who might have pieces of the puzzle. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, clear and strong despite her age. Hello? Miss Chen, my name is Michael Torres. Sarah Brennan at the library gave me your number. I was hoping I could talk to you about David Garrett. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Margaret Chen spoke again, her voice had changed, become more guarded. Why are you asking about David? Because I think he was murdered, Michael said bluntly. And I think I know why. Another pause, longer this time. Then, come to my house. I'll make tea. We should talk in person. She gave him an address on the east side of town. Michael thanked her and ended the call. He looked at Roxy, who was watching him with her dark, attentive eyes. We're getting somewhere, girl, he said. Slowly, but we're getting there. Margaret Chen's house was a small craftsman-style bungalow with a well-maintained garden and a porch lined with potted plants. Michael knocked on the door, and it opened almost immediately, as if she had been waiting just inside. The woman who greeted him was in her 70s, with silver hair cut short and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a cardigan over a simple blouse and slacks, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing arthritis. Mr. Torres, she said, looking him up and down with an appraising gaze that missed nothing. Her eyes lingered on Roxy. And who is this? Roxy. She's with me. Service animal. Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let them in. I like dogs. They're better judges of character than most people. The interior of the house was warm and cluttered in the way homes become when their occupants have lived in them for decades. Bookshelves lined every wall, sagging under the weight of volumes on every conceivable subject. Framed photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, documenting a life well lived. Margaret led him to a small sitting room where a teapot and 2 cups were already laid out on a low table. "Sit," she instructed, pouring tea with steady hands. "Now tell me why you think David Garrett was murdered." Michael sat, accepting the cup she offered. He spent the next 20 minutes laying out what he had found, describing the buried container, the documents, the photographs, Garrett's handwritten notes. He explained about the fire, about Cascade's pressure to buy his land, about the pattern of intimidation. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she set down her cup and was silent for a long moment. "I always knew," she finally said. "Not the specifics, but I knew David didn't just lose control of his car. He was too careful, too methodical. And the timing was too convenient." She looked at Michael with eyes that held old pain. "David and I were friends. Not close, but friendly. We both loved books, loved knowledge. He used to come into the library sometimes, doing research for his work. In the months before he died, he seemed troubled. Distracted. I asked him once if everything was all right, and he said he had stumbled onto something that made him wish he worked in a different field." "Did he tell you what it was?" "No. He said it was better if I didn't know. But he did say something else, something I've never forgotten. He said that if anything happened to him, I should remember that men who profit from poison will do anything to keep their poison hidden." Margaret stood and walked to one of the bookshelves, pulling out a worn photo album. She flipped through it, then removed the photograph and handed it to Michael. The photo showed a group of people at what looked like a community picnic. David Garrett was among them, a tall man with sandy hair and an easy smile, his arm around a woman who must have been his wife. A small girl, perhaps 3 years old, sat on his shoulders, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. "That was taken 3 months before he died," Margaret said. "He looks happy, doesn't he? He had everything to live for. A family. A good job. A future." Her voice hardened. "And someone took it all away because he tried to do the right thing." Michael studied the photograph, seeing the life that had been cut short, the family that had been destroyed. He thought about the daughter, who would be in her mid-20s now, who had grown up without a father because powerful men valued their profits more than human life. "What happened to his family?" Michael asked. "His wife remarried a few years later. Moved out of state, took the daughter with her. I don't blame her. There was nothing left for them here except grief and unanswered questions." Margaret took the photograph back, returning it carefully to the album. "Do you know what you're going to do with what you found?" "I'm going to expose it," Michael said. "All of it. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what Cascade did, what they've been hiding." "That's a dangerous path," Margaret warned. "They'll come after you. They'll use every resource they have to stop you." "They already tried," Michael replied. "They burned down my farm. They think that was enough to scare me off." He met her eyes. They were wrong. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you. You have the look of a man who's seen the worst the world has to offer and decided to stand against it anyway." She paused. "How can I help? I need to know who I can trust. Who in this town has the spine to stand up to Cascade, who won't fold when the pressure comes?" Margaret considered this. "Not many, I'm afraid. Cascade employs half the county directly or indirectly. Most people are too afraid of losing their livelihoods to make waves. But there are a few." She counted them off on her fingers. "There's Tom Whitmore, he runs the hardware store downtown. His son got sick from contaminated well water back in the 90s. The boy recovered, but Tom never forgot it. He's always suspected Cascade was responsible, but he never had proof. Then there's Rachel Diaz, she's a reporter for the Chronicle. Young, idealistic, hungry for a real story. She's been trying to investigate Cascade for years, but they're very good at keeping their business private. And there's Judge Ellen Hartford. She's retired now, but she still has contacts, still has influence. She never liked Cascade's strong-arm tactics. Michael committed the names to memory. 3 potential allies, 3 people who might help him turn evidence into action. It was more than he had an hour ago. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said. Garrett wasn't the only person who died suspiciously around that time. There was a rancher named Bill Henley who owned land just north of where Cascade's main facility is now. He started complaining publicly about his livestock getting sick, about dead fish in his creek. He was loud about it, made a nuisance of himself. 6 months after David died, Bill Henley had a fatal accident. Fell off his roof while doing repairs. The official story was that he slipped on wet shingles. Her tone made it clear what she thought of the official story. His widow sold the land to Cascade for a fraction of its value. She moved to Montana. Never came back. "How many others?" Michael asked quietly. "I don't know for certain. But over the years, I've noticed a pattern. People who oppose Cascade or ask too many questions tend to have unfortunate accidents or sudden financial problems that force them to leave town. It's subtle, spread out over decades, easy to dismiss as coincidence. But when you add it all up, the pattern becomes clear." Michael felt a cold anger settling in his chest. This was not just corporate malfeasance. This was systemic violence, a long campaign of intimidation and elimination carried out with ruthless efficiency. Cascade had been operating like a criminal enterprise for decades, and they had gotten away with it because they were patient, because they operated in the shadows, and because people were too afraid to fight back. "I'm going to bring them down," Michael said, his voice flat and hard. "All of them. Gerald Vance, everyone who helped him, everyone who looked the other way. They're going to face justice." Margaret looked at him with something that might have been hope or might have been pity. "I believe you mean that. But be smart about it. Don't go charging in like some avenging angel. You'll just end up dead like David. You need to be strategic. You need to build a case that's so airtight, so public, that they can't suppress it or explain it away. And you need to stay alive long enough to see it through." "I know," Michael said. "I've fought wars before. I know how to plan an operation." "This isn't a war," Margaret corrected gently. "It's an execution. You're going to execute a corporation. And that requires patience, precision, and allies you can trust absolutely." Michael stood, preparing to leave. Margaret walked him to the door, Roxy trailing behind. At the threshold, the older woman placed a hand on his arm. "David was my friend," she said quietly. "He was a good man who tried to do the right thing, and he paid for it with his life. If you can give his death meaning, if you can make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain, then you'll have my eternal gratitude. But please, be careful. I don't want to add your name to the list of people Cascade has destroyed." "I'll be careful," Michael promised. "And thank you. For the information, and for keeping David's memory alive." He drove away from Margaret Chen's house with his mind full of new information and new resolve. Roxy sat beside him, occasionally glancing over as if to check that he was all right. The sky had opened up, rain beginning to fall in cold, heavy drops that drummed against the truck's roof. Michael's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. "Torres. Mr. Torres, this is Gerald Vance." The voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm the CEO of Cascade Development Corporation. I was hoping we could have a conversation." Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't think we have anything to talk about." "Oh, I think we do," Vance replied, his tone pleasant but with an undercurrent of steel. "You see, I've been informed that you've been asking questions around town. Questions about our company, about events from many years ago. Questions that suggest you may have misunderstandings about our operations." "I don't have any misunderstandings," Michael said coldly. "I know exactly what your company did." There was a brief pause. When Vance spoke again, his voice had lost its veneer of pleasantness. then you also know that making unfounded accusations against a respected corporation could have serious legal consequences. Defamation is a serious matter, Mr. Torres. We have very aggressive attorneys. So do I, Michael lied. And I don't deal in accusations. I deal in evidence. Another pause, longer this time. I see. Well, perhaps we should meet face to face. Discuss this situation like reasonable men. I'm certain we can reach an understanding that would be beneficial for both of us. I understand you've had some financial difficulties recently. The loss of your farm must have been devastating. Cascade is prepared to make you a very generous offer for your land, far more than market value. Enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere quieter. My farm isn't for sale, Michael said. Not to you, not to anyone. Everything is for sale, Mr. Torres. It's simply a matter of finding the right price. Think about what I'm offering. A chance to rebuild your life, to put this unpleasantness behind you. All you have to do is walk away. And if I don't? Vance's voice turned ice cold. Then you'll discover that life can become very difficult for people who make themselves obstacles to progress. I would hate for you to have any more accidents, Mr. Torres. Particularly since you live alone in that little trailer on your burned property. So isolated. So vulnerable. Anything could happen out there, and no one would know until it was too late. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Michael felt the familiar adrenaline spike, the combat readiness that had kept him alive in war zones. If anything happens to me, he said quietly, the evidence I have will be released automatically. Everything. Every document, every photograph, every piece of proof of what your company did. It will go to the FBI, the EPA, every major news organization in the country. And your name will be at the top of it, Gerald Vance. Your face will be the one on every news broadcast when they talk about corporate criminals who poison their own communities. The silence on the other end was absolute. Michael could almost hear Vance's mind working, recalculating, reassessing the threat. When the CEO spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. You're making a very serious mistake. No, Michael replied. You made the mistake. You thought you could intimidate a farmer. But I'm not just a farmer. I'm a Marine. And Marines don't retreat. Think about that before you make your next move. He ended the call and immediately pulled over to the side of the road, his heart hammering in his chest. Roxy whined softly, sensing his agitation. He took several deep breaths, forcing himself to calm down, to think clearly. He had just declared war. Vance now knew that Michael had evidence, that he was not going to be bought off or scared off. The CEO would have no choice but to escalate, to take more direct action. Michael pulled out his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Tom Whitmore at the hardware store, requesting a meeting. The second was to Rachel Diaz at the newspaper, hinting that he had information about a major environmental story. The third was to a lawyer he had served with years ago, a man who now worked for a non-profit that handled environmental litigation. He left messages for all 3, knowing that speed was now essential. He had forced Cascade's hand. They would come for him soon, and when they did, he needed to be ready. He looked at Roxy, who was watching him with concern in her dark eyes. I just made things a lot worse, he told her. But at least now they know we're not backing down. The rain intensified, turning the world outside into a gray blur. Michael pulled back onto the road and headed toward his property. He had preparations to make, defenses to set up. If Cascade wanted a war, he would give them one. But this time, he would fight on his terms, and he would make sure the whole world was watching. The trailer felt smaller than usual in the darkness. Michael sat at the narrow fold-down table with a battery-powered lantern casting harsh shadows across his face. He had disconnected the trailer from the electrical grid 2 hours earlier, cutting himself off from any vulnerabilities that could be exploited remotely. The propane heater provided warmth, and the lantern gave enough light to work by. Roxy lay beneath the table, her body pressed against his legs, a warm and constant presence. On the table before him were 3 items. The aluminum container with David Garrett's evidence, now sealed and ready for transport. A detailed hand-drawn map of his property showing sight lines, approach vectors, and defensive positions. And his service pistol, cleaned and loaded, within easy reach. He had spent the afternoon preparing for what he knew was coming. The phone call with Gerald Vance had been a declaration, and declarations demanded responses. He had created a simple but effective early warning system using materials from what remained of his barn. Fishing lines strung at ankle height across likely approach paths, each line connected to empty cans filled with small rocks. Motion-activated game cameras positioned at strategic points, their infrared sensors capable of detecting movement in complete darkness. He had uploaded the camera feeds to a secure cloud server that would automatically alert his phone if anything triggered them. It was not military-grade security, but it would give him the seconds he needed to respond. The lawyer he had called, Marcus Webb, had returned his message within an hour. Webb now worked for the Environmental Justice Alliance, a non-profit that took on cases against corporate polluters. His voice over the phone had been cautious but interested when Michael described what he had found. Webb had asked him to scan and send copies of everything immediately, which Michael had done, uploading gigabytes of photographs to an encrypted server. Webb had promised to review the material overnight and get back to him by morning with a strategy. That was something, at least. A legal path forward, assuming Michael survived long enough to walk it. Rachel Diaz from the Chronicle had also called back. She was younger than he expected, her voice energetic and eager. She had been covering local government and business for 3 years, she told him, and had been trying to dig into Cascade's operations the entire time. Every lead had hit dead ends, every source had gone silent after initial conversations. She was hungry for a real story, tired of writing puff pieces about ribbon cuttings and charity fundraisers. Michael had been deliberately vague on the phone, telling her only that he had documentary evidence of serious environmental crimes and that he would provide her with everything once certain precautions were in place. She had agreed to meet him the following day at a location of his choosing. Tom Whitmore had been the most difficult conversation. The hardware store owner had listened in silence as Michael explained in general terms what he had discovered. When Michael finished, Tom had been quiet for a long moment before speaking. His voice had been thick with emotion. "My boy almost died," he had said. "He was 8 years old, drinking water from our well, and he got so sick they didn't think he would make it. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong at first. By the time they did, his kidneys were failing. He survived, but he's had health problems ever since. He's 23 now, and he still has to see specialists twice a year." Tom had paused, and Michael could hear him breathing hard. "If you're telling me Cascade did that to him, if you're telling me they poisoned my son and got away with it, then I'll do whatever it takes to help you burn them down." 3 allies. A lawyer, a journalist, and a father with a grudge. It was not an army, but it was more than he had started with. Michael checked his phone for the 10th time in as many minutes. The camera feed showed nothing but darkness and the occasional deer moving through the trees. The property was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. He knew the tactics Cascade would likely employ. They would not send their corporate security in uniforms and vehicles. They would hire contractors, men with military or law enforcement backgrounds who specialized in making problems disappear quietly. They would come at night, probably in the early hours when most people were asleep and at their most vulnerable. They would try to make it look like another accident, a gas leak in the trailer perhaps, or another fire. If they were smart, they would wait a few days, let Michael's guard down, make it seem less connected to his phone call with Vance. But Michael did not think they would be that patient. Vance had sounded rattled, and rattled men made hasty decisions. The CEO knew that Michael had evidence, knew that he was talking to people, building a case. Every day Michael remained alive was another day for that evidence to spread, for more copies to be made, for more people to become involved. From Cascade's perspective, the threat needed to be neutralized immediately. Roxy's head came up suddenly, her ears swiveling toward the western side of the property. A low growl rumbled in her chest, barely audible but unmistakable. Michael's hand went immediately to his pistol. He killed the lantern, plunging the trailer into darkness, and moved to the small window that faced west. His eyes, already adjusted to low light, scanned the tree line. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then his phone buzzed silently in his pocket. Camera alert. Motion detected on the western perimeter. He pulled up the camera feed on his phone, the screen brightness turned down to minimum. The infrared image showed two figures moving through the trees, approximately 100 yards from the trailer. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving with tactical precision, spacing themselves properly, using cover effectively. These were professionals. Michael's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. This was familiar territory. He had been in similar situations before, outnumbered and outgunned, relying on preparation and discipline to survive. He watched the feed as the two figures advanced, checking a second camera that showed a different angle. For more figures were approaching from the south, converging on the trailer from multiple directions. 6 total that he could see, possibly more that had not yet triggered the cameras. They were executing a classic pincer movement, designed to trap him inside the trailer with no escape route. Michael grabbed his go bag, a small backpack containing the essentials. Water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra ammunition, and most importantly, a portable hard drive with copies of all the evidence. He clipped Roxy's tactical leash to her harness and gave her the hand signal for silence and alert. The dog's body tensed, ready to move on his command. He could not stay in the trailer. That was exactly what they expected, what they wanted. He needed to break their pattern, do something they would not anticipate. He moved to the rear door, the one facing east, away from the approaching figures. He eased it open silently, the hinges well-oiled from his earlier preparations. The cold night air hit his face, sharp and clean. He could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the distant sound of the creek. He dropped to the ground, Roxy following immediately, her movements silent as a shadow. They moved low and fast, away from the trailer, heading for the dense tree line 50 yards away. Behind them, Michael heard the first sounds of entry. A sharp crack as the trailer's front door was forced open, followed by shouted commands. They were inside, searching for him, finding the space empty. Michael and Roxy reached the trees and kept moving, putting distance between themselves and the trailer. He heard more shouting behind him, angry now, confused. They had expected to find him asleep or at least trapped. Instead, they had found nothing. He allowed himself a grim smile. First rule of combat: never be where the enemy expects you to be. He moved through the forest with practiced stealth, his feet finding purchase on the uneven ground without conscious thought. Roxy moved beside him, her senses far sharper than his, guiding him around obstacles in the darkness. They circled wide, heading toward a position he had scouted earlier, a small rise that overlooked the trailer and provided good cover. From there, he could observe what happened next. He settled into position behind a fallen log, Roxy beside him, both of them invisible in the shadows. Through the trees, he could see the trailer clearly. Lights were moving inside, flashlight beams cutting through the windows. Then the lights went out, and figures began emerging from the trailer, 6 men spreading out, beginning a search pattern. They were methodical, professional, but they had lost the element of surprise. Now they were hunting in unfamiliar territory against a target who knew the ground intimately. Michael pulled out his phone and activated the voice recorder, documenting everything he was seeing. The number of men, their tactics, their equipment. This was evidence, proof of the harassment and attempted violence. He zoomed the phone's camera and captured images of the figures, the license plate of a dark SUV that was parked on his access road with its lights off. One of the men pulled out a phone, speaking urgently to someone. Michael could not hear the words, but he could imagine the conversation. The target had fled. They had failed. What were their orders now? The conversation lasted less than a minute. Then the man gestured to the others, and they began moving back toward their vehicle. But one of them stopped, turning to look back at the trailer. He said something to the others, pointing. 2 men split off, returning to the trailer. Michael watched through his phone's camera as they did something to the propane tank, then moved quickly away. Understanding hit him like ice water. They were going to destroy the evidence. If they could not get to him, they would eliminate anything that might remain in the trailer. The explosion, when it came, was smaller than he expected but effective. The propane tank ruptured with a dull boom, and flames erupted from the rear of the trailer, quickly spreading. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed, metal and plastic burning with toxic black smoke that rose into the night sky. Michael watched it burn, feeling nothing. The trailer had been temporary shelter, nothing more. Everything that mattered was either in his backpack or already uploaded to secure servers. Let them think they had accomplished something. Let them report back to Vance that the problem had been handled. The men climbed into their SUV and drove away, their taillights disappearing down the access road. Michael waited another 30 minutes, making certain they were truly gone, that this was not a feint designed to draw him out. Only when he was satisfied did he move, working his way back toward what remained of his property. The fire had burned itself out by the time he reached it, leaving nothing but a smoking metal skeleton. He stood at a distance, watching the last flames flicker and die. Roxy pressed against his leg, whining softly. He reached down and scratched behind her ears. "I know, girl," he said quietly. "But we're okay. That's what matters." His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. That was a warning. "Next time we won't miss. Last chance to walk away." Michael deleted the message without responding. They had shown their hand, revealed the lengths they were willing to go to. That was useful information. It also meant the stakes had been raised to the maximum level. There would be no more warnings, no more attempts at intimidation. The next move would be lethal. He could not stay on his property. That much was clear. They knew where he lived, and they would be watching. He needed to disappear, at least temporarily, while he coordinated with his allies and prepared the evidence for release. He had planned for this contingency. He had a place to go, a small cabin owned by another veteran he had served with, a man named Derek Mills who lived 2 hours north in the mountains. Derek had made it clear years ago that if Michael ever needed to go off-grid, the cabin was available, no questions asked. Michael pulled out a burner phone he had purchased earlier, one that could not be traced back to him. He sent a brief text to the number Derek had given him for emergencies. "Need the cabin. Coming tonight. Bringing company." The response came back within seconds. "Key under the planter. Stay safe." He returned to his truck, which he had parked in a concealed location a quarter-mile from the trailer, hidden beneath camouflage netting. Roxy jumped into the passenger seat, and Michael started the engine, keeping the headlights off until he reached the main road. As he drove north into the mountains, he called Marcus Webb, the lawyer. Webb answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "Torres. I was just going over your files. This is extraordinary. The evidence you have is absolutely damning. If even half of this holds up under scrutiny, we can bring criminal charges. We can shut Cascade down." "They just tried to kill me," Michael said flatly. "Sent 6 men to my property. Burned down the trailer I was living in." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I saw them coming. But this changes things. I need protection, and I need this evidence in the hands of federal authorities immediately. If something happens to me, I need to know the case will move forward." "Understood," Webb said, his voice shifting into crisis management mode. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm contacting the FBI field office in Boise right now. I have a contact there, an agent who specializes in environmental crimes and corporate corruption. His name is Richard Cortez, and he's one of the good ones. I'll brief him tonight and arrange a meeting for tomorrow. Second, I'm filing emergency motions with the federal court first thing in the morning, requesting protective orders and preliminary injunctions. Third, I'm reaching out to our media contacts. If this goes public quickly enough, it becomes too expensive for Cascade to keep trying to silence you." "What about witness protection?" Michael asked. "That's a possibility, but it requires federal involvement, which we don't have yet. For now, you need to stay mobile and stay smart. Where are you going? Better if you don't know, Michael replied. I'll contact you tomorrow morning with a secure meeting location. All right. Michael, listen to me. What you're doing is incredibly brave, but it's also incredibly dangerous. These people have already killed to protect their secrets. Don't underestimate them. I'm a Marine, Michael said. I've dealt with worse. I'll see you tomorrow. He ended the call and drove in silence for a while, the dark landscape flowing past his windows. Roxy had settled in the seat beside him, her head resting on her paws, but her eyes remained open, watchful. Michael reached over and rested his hand on her back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. The cabin Derek had offered was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. It sat on the edge of a small lake, surrounded by towering pines, with no neighbors within miles. It was the kind of place where a man could vanish completely, at least for a while. Michael reached it just after 2 in the morning, navigating the final stretch with only his parking lights to guide him. The cabin was small and rustic, a single room with a wood stove, a cot, and basic supplies. The key was exactly where Derek had said it would be. Michael let himself in, Roxy following, and immediately set about making the space secure. He checked the windows, ensuring they locked properly, wedged the door with a chair, and positioned himself so he had a clear line of sight to the only entrance. Only then did he allow himself to sit down, his back against the wall, his pistol within reach. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, his mind turning over plans and contingencies. Roxy dozed fitfully beside him, occasionally lifting her head to check on him before settling again. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Michael finally allowed himself to acknowledge the exhaustion that weighed on his limbs. But there would be time to rest later. Right now, there was work to do. At 7 in the morning, he called Rachel Diaz. She answered immediately, her voice bright with energy. Mr. Torres, I've been waiting for your call. When can we meet? Today. But not in town. I need you to drive north on Highway 95. I'll send you coordinates for a rest stop where we can talk. Come alone, and make sure you're not followed. Followed? She sounded surprised. Are you serious? Deadly serious. Cascade tried to kill me last night. They burned down the trailer I was living in. If you're going to work with me on this story, you need to understand the risks. There was a pause, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice had changed, become more focused. I understand. Send me the coordinates. I'll be there in 2 hours. Michael ended the call and sent her the location of a roadside rest area halfway between Riverside and the cabin. Then he called Tom Whitmore. The hardware store owner answered with a gruff Whitmore. Tom, it's Michael Torres. I need supplies. Can you get me a list of items without anyone knowing? Depends on what you need. Michael rattled off a list. Additional ammunition, a portable police scanner, a better first aid kit, several burner phones, and some basic camping gear. Tom listened without interrupting. I can have all that ready in an hour, he said. Where do you want me to bring it? I'll come to you. Just don't tell anyone I'm coming. Michael gave him an approximate time, then ended the call. The next call was the most important. Marcus Webb had sent him a text message with a phone number and a brief message, call Agent Cortez. He's expecting you. Michael dialed the number. It was answered on the first ring by a man with a deep, authoritative voice. Special Agent Richard Cortez, FBI. Agent Cortez, my name is Michael Torres. Marcus Webb said you'd be expecting my call. Mr. Torres. I've been briefed on your situation. I spent most of the night reviewing the files Marcus sent me. If this evidence is authentic, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, you've uncovered one of the most extensive corporate environmental crimes I've seen in 20 years. This is big, Mr. Torres. Very big. Big enough to bring charges? Absolutely. We're talking about violations of the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, conspiracy, fraud, possibly manslaughter if we can connect the contamination to specific deaths. This is a RICO case waiting to happen. But we need to move carefully. Cascade Development Corporation has substantial resources and political connections. If we move too fast, they'll bury this in litigation for years. We need to build an airtight case. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe months. We need to verify the evidence, track down witnesses, gather additional documentation. This is going to be a major federal investigation. I don't have weeks, Michael said. They tried to kill me last night. They're going to try again. I understand. That's why I'm arranging protective custody for you. Where are you right now? Michael hesitated. Trusting a federal agent meant putting his life in someone else's hands, and trust did not come easily. But he also recognized that he could not fight this battle alone. I'm at a secure location. I'd rather not disclose it over the phone. Smart. Here's what we're going to do. I'm driving up to the Riverside area today with a team. We'll meet at a location of your choosing. You bring the physical evidence, we take you into protective custody, and we begin the formal investigation. In the meantime, I'm coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office to prepare search warrants for Cascade's facilities and executive offices. We're going to move on this fast, but we're going to do it right. What about the people at Cascade who are responsible? Gerald Vance and the others? If the evidence supports it, they'll be arrested. We'll freeze corporate assets, seize documents, interview employees. We'll tear that company apart piece by piece until we know everyone who was involved and everyone who looked the other way. But I need you to trust the process, Mr. Torres. I know you're a soldier, and soldiers want to take direct action. But this has to be done through the legal system. That's the only way to make sure these people actually pay for what they've done. Michael thought about David Garrett, about Bill Henley the rancher, about all the other people whose lives had been destroyed by Cascade's greed and violence. He thought about Tom Whitmore's son, about the communities that had been poisoned, about the decades of lies and cover-ups. And he made his decision. All right, he said. I'll meet you. But I want guarantees. I want to know that this case will move forward even if something happens to me. I want to know that my evidence will be used. You have my word, Cortez said. And more than that, you have my commitment. I've spent my entire career going after people who think they're above the law. This is exactly the kind of case I live for. We're going to bring them down, Mr. Torres. All of them. They arranged a meeting for late afternoon at a location Michael would disclose 1 hour in advance. Cortez gave him a secure phone number and emphasized that he should call immediately if there were any further threats or incidents. Michael ended the call and sat back, feeling a small measure of relief. The machinery of justice was beginning to turn. It was slow, bureaucratic, frustratingly methodical, but it was also powerful. Once the FBI was involved, once federal warrants were issued, Cascade's ability to suppress the story would be dramatically reduced. He spent the rest of the morning preparing. He organized all the physical evidence, creating a detailed inventory. He charged all his electronics, ensuring he had backup power. He cleaned his weapons, though he hoped he would not need them again. And he spent time with Roxy, taking her down to the lake, letting her swim in the cold water and shake herself dry on the rocky shore. She deserved a moment of peace, a reminder that not everything in the world was violence and danger. At noon, he drove to meet Rachel Diaz at the rest stop. She was already there when he arrived, standing beside a compact sedan, her camera bag slung over one shoulder. She was younger than he had imagined, perhaps 28, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore practical clothes, jeans and a fleece jacket, and she carried herself with confidence. Mr. Torres, she said as he approached, extending her hand. Thank you for trusting me with this. Call me Michael, he replied, shaking her hand. And I'm trusting you because I don't have a lot of options. But I need you to understand something. This story is going to make you a target. The people I'm up against have already tried to kill me. They've murdered others. If you publish what I'm about to give you, they'll come after you too. Rachel's expression did not change. I became a journalist to tell stories that matter, stories that powerful people don't want told. If there's risk involved, that means the story is worth telling. Show me what you have. Michael spent the next hour walking her through everything. The buried evidence, David Garrett's notes, the photographs, the test results, the corporate memos. He showed her the documentation of his own harassment, the fire at his farm, the attack the previous night. He gave her copies of everything, both digital and physical, and he explained the connections, the pattern of violence and cover-up that stretched back decades. Rachel listened with complete focus, occasionally asking questions, taking notes, photographing documents. When Michael finished, she sat back in her car, her expression grave. "This is going to destroy them," she said quietly. "This is going to be the biggest story in Idaho history." "The FBI is getting involved," Michael told her. "Agent Richard Cortez is meeting me this afternoon. Once they start their investigation, this becomes official. But I want you to publish first. I want the story out there before Cascade has a chance to spin it or suppress it. Can you do that?" "I can have the first article ready by tonight," Rachel said. "But I need to verify some of this independently. I need to contact sources, get official comments. That's going to take time." "You have until tomorrow morning," Michael said. "After that, the FBI moves, and the story breaks whether you're ready or not. I'd rather you be the one to tell it." Rachel nodded. "I'll make it work. But Michael, you need to be careful. Once this story goes live, you become public enemy number one for some very dangerous people. Make sure the FBI keeps you safe." "That's the plan," Michael replied. They parted ways, Rachel driving back toward Riverside with a cargo of explosive evidence, Michael heading to meet Tom Whitmore for supplies. The hardware store owner was waiting in the back alley behind his shop, a box of equipment already loaded in the bed of his truck. He helped Michael transfer it to his vehicle without saying much, but before Michael could leave, Tom grabbed his arm. "My boy is coming with me tomorrow," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "When this story breaks, when the FBI raids Cascade, I want him to see it. I want him to know that the people who hurt him are finally being held accountable. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for not walking away." Michael nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He drove back to the cabin, unloaded the supplies, and began the final preparations. At 4 p.m, he called Agent Cortez and gave him the coordinates for a meeting point, a remote logging road 10 miles from the cabin. Cortez confirmed he would be there in 1 hour. Michael loaded Roxy into the truck and drove to the meeting location, arriving 15 minutes early. He positioned his vehicle so he could see the approach from both directions, and he waited. Precisely at 5 o'clock, 2 black SUVs appeared, moving slowly up the logging road. They stopped 50 yards away, and a man emerged from the lead vehicle. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face, wearing a dark suit and a bulletproof vest visible beneath his jacket. He raised his hands to show he was unarmed and walked forward slowly. "Michael Torres?" he called out. "That's me. Are you Cortez?" "Special Agent Richard Cortez. I have 3 other agents with me. We're here to help you." Michael studied him for a long moment, his instincts probing for any sign of deception. He saw only professionalism and sincerity. He stepped out of his truck, carrying the aluminum container. "This is the original evidence. I have digital copies in multiple secure locations. If anything happens to me, they'll be released automatically." Cortez took the container carefully, as if it were made of glass. "You have my word that this will be handled properly. And you have my personal commitment that we will see this through to the end." He gestured toward the SUVs. "We have a safe house prepared for you. It's a secure facility where you can stay while we conduct the investigation. You'll have protection around the clock. What about my dog? She comes with you. We understand she's part of your support system. Michael loaded his few possessions into one of the SUVs, and Roxy jumped in beside him. As they drove away from the meeting point, surrounded by federal agents, Michael felt the tension that had been coiled in his chest for weeks finally begin to ease. He was not safe, not yet, but he was no longer alone. The weight of the evidence had been transferred to people with the power to act on it. All he could do now was wait and trust that justice would be done. 3 days later, Rachel Diaz's article appeared on the front page of the Riverside Chronicle under the headline "Corporate Giant Accused of Decades of Environmental Crime and Cover-Up." The article was exhaustive, detailing the evidence, the victims, the suppressed investigations. It named Gerald Vance and other Cascade executives. It included statements from Tom Whitmore, from Margaret Chen, from families whose loved ones had died or been sickened. The story was picked up by wire services within hours and by evening was being covered by national news networks. The next morning, FBI agents executed simultaneous search warrants at Cascade Development Corporation's headquarters, its regional facilities, and the homes of its senior executives. Gerald Vance was arrested at his office and led out in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. Over the following weeks, more arrests followed. Corporate files were seized. Bank accounts were frozen. Employees began cooperating with investigators, providing testimony in exchange for immunity. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than Michael had imagined. Cascade had been illegally dumping toxic waste for over 30 years, poisoning groundwater across 5 counties. They had bribed state officials, falsified environmental reports, and systematically intimidated or eliminated anyone who threatened to expose them. The death toll, when investigators finally compiled it, was staggering. At least 17 people had died from cancers and organ failures directly linked to the contamination. Dozens more had been sickened. And the environmental damage would take decades to repair. Gerald Vance and 4 other executives were indicted on federal charges including conspiracy, environmental crimes, fraud, racketeering, and in connection with David Garrett's death, second-degree murder. The trials would take years, but the evidence was overwhelming. Cascade Development Corporation, once a billion-dollar enterprise, was dismantled. Its assets were liquidated to pay for cleanup efforts and victim compensation. Michael Torres spent 6 months in protective custody before the immediate threats against his life were neutralized. When he finally emerged, he found himself transformed from a reclusive veteran into a reluctant public figure. He gave testimony at multiple trials. He spoke at environmental conferences. He became an advocate for whistleblower protections and corporate accountability. But he never forgot what it had cost. His farm was gone, reduced to scorched earth and bitter memories. The peace he had sought remained elusive, replaced by a different kind of purpose. He had not found redemption in the quiet cultivation of land. He had found it in the loud, messy, dangerous work of fighting for justice. A year after the arrests, Michael stood once again on what had been his property. The land had been purchased by a conservation trust and would be preserved as open space, never to be developed. It seemed fitting. He walked across the blackened ground to the place where Roxy had first begun digging, where everything had started. The Belgian Malinois walked beside him, older now but still alert, still loyal. He knelt and ran his hand through the soil, feeling its texture, remembering the moment when a trained dog's instincts had uncovered a secret that powerful men had tried to bury forever. He thought about David Garrett, whose courage and foresight had made all of this possible. He thought about the victims, those who had died and those who had survived. He thought about justice, imperfect and slow but finally achieved. "We did good, girl," he said quietly to Roxy. "We did what needed to be done." The dog pressed against his leg, her warmth a reminder that even in the darkest fights, he had never been truly alone. They stood together in the ruins of what had been, looking toward a future that would be built on truth instead of lies, on accountability instead of corruption. The war was over. The mission was complete. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, Michael Torres felt something close to peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.